All right, man. So we are back again. And like I promised or said, I didn't promise. But what I said I was going to do a piece on hitting bottom, hitting rock bottom. And I think this is very, very important. And hitting bottom in the recovery sense means that a person has come to a place where they can no longer rationalize in their thinking their addictive behavior, to also include their primary symptoms. So for simplicity, and those that's keeping up with my videos or have an understanding of the recovery process already, and at this point, I'd like to add, hit my subscribe button. Hit my subscribe button. Comment in the comments, and we'll address those as we go along. So moving on, I got the name of the video is Being Under the Spell of Addiction. Being under the spell of, what is this? Leave it alone. But also, we're talking about hitting bottom, being up under the spell of denial and hitting bottom. All right, I had to relax a little bit, So anyway, moving on. I'm going to give a simple definition of addiction, what addiction is, what the symptoms are, and then we'll move straight into being under the spell of denial and how to come out of that spell. How to come out of denial. So, that being said, let's recover, y'all. Let's recover. Let's do this thing. So let's get into the video. What is addiction? Addiction is very simple in the recovery sense. It is obsessive thinking and compulsive behavior that results in total, and I have to say total self-centered behavior, not self-centered behavior, but total self-centered. And given an example of total self-centered, that's when the individual or the group does not have any regards for a person's safety, welfare, property, or anything that's connected to them and themselves to a certain point. Yes, they are involved. And when you're up under the spell of denial, that means inside the mind, you have completely rationalized mentally, physically, spiritually, and emotionally your behavior. In addiction, there are symptoms. There are outside symptoms that will point towards the addiction. And what are they? And these are the things that people get confused about. Drugs, alcohol, sex, gambling, food, workaholics, people that tend to work. Fantasy must include fantasy. Why do I include fantasy? Because in most cases, fantasy was mostly every addicted person's, their relationship with fantasy kicked off that addiction. Oh yeah. And we'll get into that. So these are the symptoms of the disease of addiction. And can a person have more than one? Yes, they can. They can have, they call them what? Cross-addicted. They say, I'm cross-addicted. When a person is cross-addicted, they have more than one symptom is at play. And usually a person does have more than one. I'm willing to say, and I'm gonna step out on this. Usually an addict will have at least two. And fantasy is going to be the one. fantasy is going to be there somewhere. And then they can have fantasy in sex, fantasy in gambling, fantasy in overeating, fantasy in working. Because why? Fantasy will be the vehicle that's going to, in most cases, will carry the other symptoms. That's what's going on. So let's move on. Let's move on. Being under the spell of denial. Fantasy will also support the denial. Why? Because fantasy is connected to the brain, is connected to the thinking. And addiction is said to be a thinking disease. Also, when I say addiction, for simplicity, I will include alcohol or alcoholism. And that's just for simplicity. There's a lot of debate going on about that. But for those whose primary drug of choice was alcohol or is alcohol, this is just for simplicity. Work out the details on a later date. So now that, and I've also mentioned that the doorway into addiction is usually through trauma. A person or group have experienced so much trauma, or they have experienced a traumatic event that they have start developing, that they have experienced a traumatic event that have affected them so much that they have developed different personalities to protect them. And denial, and using the process of denial, that supports their case for denial. And for simplicity, what type of trauma do we have? There's there's 4 types of trauma. And I talked about trauma on the earlier video. But however, I'll just go over the names and what they are, and we'll move on. And the first type of trauma is called acute trauma. And that's when a person experienced a single incident that is life-threatening, or they could feel danger, a sense of danger. One incident. Then we have chronic trauma. Chronic trauma comes from when the individual or a group experience the same traumatic event over and over again. It's the same traumatic event over and over again. And then we have complex trauma. Inside of complex trauma, the individual or the group experience trauma, various types of trauma, at least 2 or more types of trauma in the same time period over and over again. So it could be like a car accident, molestation, loss of their job. They could went homeless. And at that point, that is the definition of complex trauma. Then you have another type of trauma or a result of trauma, and it's called PTSD, and it's called post-traumatic stress syndrome, PTSD. And it usually happens in children before they reach adolescence. And they could have been exposed to living in grew up in a juvenile setting, a juvenile a juvenile facility. They could have come from a home where there was no loving and caring inside that home, a lot of abuse, or in foster care, also to include foster care. And I'm not saying all foster cares are like that, but it usually happens. Or it could happen inside of a neighborhood. So PTSD is a result of a youth growing up through traumatic events, and then after they reach an age of maturity, then they start having the symptoms of what? Addiction. The symptoms of addiction can show up, and I talked about those symptoms earlier. Now, moving on, and I got my notes here, so I'll be flipping, and I'm flipping to the part where we're talking about hitting the bottom and bam, it should be showing up somewhere. But anyway, I already know what hidden bottom is. So what has happened when the person is inside their addiction, and their addiction is full blown, and when I say full blown, I mean that their symptoms have dominated their life to the point where mentally, spiritually, and when I say, and when I talk about spiritually or spirituality, I am referring to an energy that comes from within. I'm not referring to anything that has to do with a religious dogma. For simplicity, I'm talking about energy or energetically. And energetically, something that, principles that a person may practice that will keep them, or that cause them to navigate through society, or navigate in their, to navigate through society or how they're living. This is what I mean when I say energy. So I'm still trying to find my my notes for hitting bottom. Even though I know what it is, I have a way I want to deliver this. So anyway, moving on, and I'm not gonna really thump through them. They gonna pop up. But at the same time, so when a person experiences their full-blown addiction, it gets them to the point where they can no longer deny their addiction through their symptoms. And as a result, they hit what's called a bottom. And the bottom is it's a painful event. It's a painful event that happens in their life that's just as great, is just as equal to or greater than the trauma that propelled them into their addiction. Let me say that again. Inside the hitting bottom process, a person experienced pain mentally, physically, spiritually, and emotionally that is equal or greater than the trauma that propelled them into the process of addiction. Because, like I talked about before, I said that trauma is the seeds of addiction. Trauma is the seeds of addiction. Without trauma, there will be no addiction in most cases. And I say most cases because maybe there's something out there I don't know about. Quite sure it is. So anyway, let's move on. So what happens inside these traumatic events is that they are so painful that a person or the group will flat out deny anything. They will flat out deny or disassociate themselves with anything or with the event itself. They will refuse to admit that an event took place, or they would take the event and over-exaggerate it to the point where they can justify or rationalize certain behaviors that they use. And it's the same case as the refusal to admit that something has happened. So denial is very powerful. And the reason why I call it a spell is because the individuals or the group's refusal to admit that something has happened, not only accept to to admit is that at this point, they go into their mind and they create all sorts of reasonings and rationalities to justify either their using of the symptoms or why they're at a certain place in their recovery, that to reason why they are at a certain place in their recovery and they need to stay there. And if you're using it in the recovery sense, this is you are on the path of what's called relapse. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So when I talked about denial, the definition that I gave in a previous video, and I had to talk about the denial in order to get to the hitting of the bottom, because if the bottom is not hit, if it's not hit solid, if it's not a solid hit, then the person entering into the recovery process, they will have a lot of problems. They will have a lot of problems because denial is cunning and it's baffling, and it will creep in even though a person can become clean or sober. They can become clean and sober, and they can be well into the recovery process and still go back to using. They can go to jail. They can end up in the institution, and they can die. Because those are the alternatives for recovery. So what is denial? Denial, failure to acknowledge an unacceptable truth or emotion, or to admit it into consciousness. And it's also used as a defense mechanism. So if it's used as a defense mechanism, it has many variables. There are many variables that can be applied, and for simplicity, a lot of excuses. When I say many variables, I guess I'm trying to sound important or something, right? There could be many variables or many excuses that's created in the mind. Now remember, addiction and alcoholism is a thinking disease. It's embedded in the thinking through the denial process that was caused by what? By traumatic events that happen in a person's life. Through traumatic events that happen in a person's or group life. So let's move on. Inside the denial process, people or the groups will develop what's called dissociative disorders. They will begin to disassociate themselves from the reality of what is happening to them. They would tend to disassociate themselves from the event or events that have happened in their lives that put their lives into a tailspin. So dissociative disorders are mental disorders that involve experiencing a disconnection and lack of continuity between thought, memories, surroundings, actions, and identities. Note, people with dissociative behavior disorder escape reality. Check this out. They escape reality in ways that are involuntary and unhealthy and cause problems with functioning in everyday life. In other words, a person will live in what I said, a fantasy land. Remember I talked about fantasy a long time ago? When you break down what I just read, fantasy, they refuse to look at the reality of a situation. So if you're not looking at reality, what are you looking at? What is an individual looking at? Or where's their mind based from? In fantasy land, in fantasy land. And what has to do with that, and I'm not going to really get off into it, is resentment, anger, and fear. And inside the resentment, a person is angry at their past. And I'll set the past anywhere from 90 days to beyond. They're angry at their past. And then anger is anger in the present. And what they'll tend to do is they'll live in fear. And that fear is fear of the future. And that's when, and in all three incidences or in all three emotions, resentment, anger, and fear, the person will use their fantasy. They'll use their fantasy as a tool to keep them into what? Denial. That's why hitting bottom has to be a greater force as when the traumatic event happened, because the dynamics of the traumatic events is complex. And that's the person mind develops, and they don't have to develop a whole lot, because their denial could be their denial pattern could be embedded so much that it could just be from A, B, C, D, A, B, C, D, D, C, B, A, D, C, B, A. You know, they can go, it can travel in that pattern. And then it could be so complicated that a person could just be, I can't even explain that one. That's how I've seen it. I've seen denial work. And then I'm talking about my own denial. A person would tend to deny reality with so much, and the reasoning that they will use to justify and rationalize their denial is very, very, very complex. It could be simple to complex. So moving on, and I'm trying to get lucky and find my page where I talk about the and let me say this. So inside the and I'm gonna hit this note here. Inside the denial process, what happens is that when the trauma occurs, the person would tend to develop, the person or the group, and groups take on personalities, and we'll talk about that later. What happens is the individual will start developing personalities. They would just start developing personalities as a part of their denial system. So they'll develop these personalities. Carl Jung called it the shadow self. And we hear it every day. We hear these terms. This what I'm referring to is when the individual will take on nicknames. They might take on nicknames, or they might name them their personalities. And this doesn't have to happen with everyone. For example, let me say this. So a person might be named born John Doe. And then as a result of some trauma, they might come up with a name, Slick John. Or their name might become Jane Doe. And they might come up with the name of Janie D. That's Janie D right there. So, and on and on and on. So what has happened, Janie D is a personality, is an alternate personality. And this is called a shadow self. And it's embedded in, and these individuals come out of where? They come out of the thinking. So when certain events happen, what happens is this person is stepped forward. So let's say a person is a banker, right? You know, Jane Doe is a banker. So Jane Doe, she count money and cash checks and do whatever it is. But at night, when she finishes that, and Another person might step forward when she get out of work. Janie D. She go to the club, you know, she's into a nightlife behavior and so forth and so forth. You know, she could become a predator, molester, a stripper, whatever. These types of identities are also created from where? From the mind, and they are thoroughly defended through where? Through the denial system, through the denial system. So the shadow, the shadow, and let me read a little bit on that because I got a little information on the shadow. It says the shadow wants to be, the shadow will put forth, will put you in different situations to reintegrate traits, attracting the same type of mates and over and over. So Janie the banker versus Janie the street person. So Janie the baker might appear to be nerdy and all that in that atmosphere, but once you step out and enter another atmosphere, she is something entirely different. She might be a gangster carrying a pistol, so forth and so forth. But let me move on. I want to move on. I want to move on. So moving on, so let's get to the bottom. Let's talk about bottom. And what is the bottom? Like I said, the bottom appears in, let me give it a good look. Y'all give me 1 second while I give this thing a good look. Because the note that I had is very, very important. And I really ain't got that many notes, really. Now this is when editing comes in, awesome. so I will have to learn how to edit. So anyway, let me go on here and talk about my personal experience with hitting bottom. So hitting bottom has to be everything I just talked about. From trauma to denial and getting into recovery. The individual, in order for a person to enter into recovery, they're going to have to smash, or I ain't going to say smash, let me take that back. They're going to have to come face to face to whatever they think they believe. And how you come face to face is to confront a situation that you are, or an experience that you are in denial about, right? It's the only way. So moving on, as the person tends to take on symptoms, and let me back up. Very simply, their life is falling apart. Their life is falling apart. They become socially unacceptable. They get to a point they have nowhere to live. No money. Well, they can have money. They can have money. I take that back. But if you got some money, that's really going to support your denial. But they get to a point where they begin to see they begin to see themselves in their own light that their denial has hid from them. And they begin to experience, they can no longer deny how they're living. And it can manifest through their symptoms and through a series of their symptoms, or it could just, one thing can happen. And they can say, no, I don't want to live like this. However, the event must be just as powerful or a greater experience, and I found it, then the traumatic event. It must be just as great of experience to break the spell of denial. Because remember, what you're shooting for, long story short, is a reversal in the thinking patterns that has the individual inside of their denial. Yeah. So that being said, that being said, the person or the individual, like I said, must hit it. So how they going to hit it? Let me take my mind off these notes and stay on this video. The question is, how do the individual hit it? How does the individual hit it? Well, in my case, man, I had done other people great harm, so much harm that it could have cost me my life. It may be somebody else theirs. I was already up into this traumatic event that changed my thinking. I was already had become willing. I had a certain amount of what came into my consciousness or my spiritual awakening was what I was doing was not right. I began to have feelings about the way I was treating myself and other people. Right. Especially myself. I knew that in my being, I didn't say in my mind, I didn't say in my heart, I said in my being, I knew I was a better person. But I was caught and I was trapped up. I was caught up and I knew that jails, institutions, and death was right around the corner. And some of those I had experienced already. I had experienced some of those already. So that being said I had to get, when the ultimatum was brought to me, either you're going to go here or you're going to go there as a result of what I did, because they said, look at what you did. You did this. I could no longer rationalize my behavior. No longer rationalize my thinking. I could no longer come up with any excuses. But what was on my side was I had the willingness. I was just caught up into my symptoms. But I already had willingness. And what I'm trying to say is, what I believe, if a person don't have some type of willingness to deal with their denial, the bottom will not be effective. And you can get clean, you can get sober, but at some point in your recovery process, or at some point in your staying clean and sober, that which you have not addressed is going to come straight right back to you. And you could fend it off for years. You could fend it off for years and months and days. But until you have hit a thorough bottom, the addiction is so cunning and baffling and planted in your mind, man, it's going to come back and get you. And either you're going to deal with that reservation, that's what we call them. Either you're going to deal with that reservation then, or you're going to pick up. Yeah. Or you're going to pick up. And when you pick up this time, you might, kill yourself or hurt somebody else. So that being said, the hitting of the bottom must be as powerful. It must have a powerful impact on the individual, just like the addiction did. And it usually, and I'll say this, go out on a limb, it's going to usually have something that was overlooked inside the trauma, whether intentionally, or intentionally. It's going to have something to do that was overlooked inside the trauma. inside that traumatic event. So that being said, hitting the bottom is important. Some people say that I've heard people say there's a trap door. Why do people relapse? There's a trap door. No, there wasn't a trap door. I don't believe bottoms have trap doors. What I believe is that a person they hit a bottom and then it wasn't thorough. The bottom wasn't thorough. It was something that they didn't look at or they looked over. And the denial set in. I believe it could happen because it happened to me. It happened to me when I was in recovery, in early recovery. And let me say this, it didn't have to be an early recovery because a lot of time, okay, so let me say this. So I've been in recovery for 36 years and a few weeks. However, I've been clean for 35 years and about, 9 months, 8 months. So what happened? When I used again, y'all told me to stay away from people, places, and things. Don't go around old people, places, and things. And I went around some people, and I went around a place. And what happened was I used because I had a reservation. I had a reservation. My reservation was I thought that I was, quote unquote, normal. That I can go around people, places, and things. And so what happens, I believe, and so when that event took place, or I used again, inside of my 35 years, when I got shaky, because I always get a little shaky in my recovery when I'm not doing something that's not conducive to my recovery. So what happens is when I get to a certain place and I start seeing things or reoccurring patterns appear, then I had to really look at the direction my recovery is going in. And a lot of times that has to do with my ego. So that being said, recovery has a lot to do with with what? Ridding one's of one's ego. I'll say that for sure. Let me check my time. I'll say that for sure. It has a lot to do with ego deflation. Because why? Ego possess character traits that are not conducive to one's recovery. It's not. And what happens is, in order to protect the ego, one will go into denial. And then now the ego is compilations of the shadow self. And the shadow self is in direct relations to what? To the traumatic events. Because when I had my traumatic events, when I had my traumatic events in the past, and I talked about resentment, what happened was I developed certain personalities to help me get through. But what happened was inside the recovery process, I did not fully address. And in step work, it's called the exact nature. I might have talked about the wrong, but I didn't talk about the what? The exact nature of the wrong. So that being said, thus, my surrender, or my bottom that I hit to surrender, the bottom that I hit to surrender was not hard enough. There was some feathers there. But it was sufficient enough for me to sustain some recovery. So I sustained the recovery, but at some point, remember, at some point, what happened was I had got to a place in my life where I had to address those patterns because they kept coming up. The patterns kept coming up. So this is what so what happened was also I went back into the spell, or I had a relapse and got up under the spell of denial, because denial, let me say this, in my belief, will never go nowhere. It will always be present in some form, in some fashion. And unless I have a spiritual awakening or be conscious enough to identify the symptoms of denial, I'm vulnerable. My recovery is vulnerable. I didn't say in danger. There's a certain vulnerability there. So hitting the bottom has to be thorough. Now, when I hit my initial bottom, was it thorough? No, but it was enough. It was enough that I had an awakening. I became conscious of what? Of my addiction or my addictive thinking. And then as I began to grow in recovery, continue to make meetings, continue to do step work, and continue to go to other programs, because I'll say, I went outside the group plenty of times to get some recovery. As I got one-on-one counseling and so forth, then I had to identify certain symptoms that I had overlooked or missed, whether it was intentional or unintentional. So my bottom was an ongoing process after my initial hit. No, it wasn't 100%, but it was enough. I would say it was around 70, 80%. It was enough to shock me into what? Into reality. Into the reality of what? Not my living, but my thinking. See, because I was told early on in recovery, what? That my best thinking got me to the point where I was at now. And y'all said, my best thinking. You didn't say my thinking, you said my best thinking. And I started telling people that too. I said, yeah, your best thinking got you here. But I had, for whatever reason, refused to identify, so that made my bottom vulnerable. So and I could put it like this, right? You go to the dealership, you buy your brand new car brand spanking new, and you don't expect nothing to go wrong with it. And then after like 3-4 months, you driving this car and you get a letter in the mail and it says, well, this car has a defect. You need to bring it back or this is going to happen. Well, it's the same way with hitting bottom. It's not going to be 100%. It's going to be certain things, character defects and shortcomings, and I get straight to it, that the individual's going to still have to address that's connected to that traumatic event from the past, and we call it resentment. And I'm still trying to find my hitting bottom. I got the page, but I ain't got the page I want, right? Because I got some on there. And so I'm going to show y'all what has kicked in, right? Obsession and compulsion. I'm obsessed and compulsive about finding this little piece I put on about the bottom. Because it's something that I wanted, out of everything I done told you, or expressed in this video, I'm saying this one piece is the bomb. But that's how I go, man. So we actually seen it. We've actually witnessed addiction, obsessive and compulsive behavior. You know. So anyway, we're gonna wrap this up. I got some things I need to get out here and take care of, but let's recover. You know, hit the subscribe button. So in summing this up, I talked about being under the spell of denial in relationship to hitting the bottom. And just like addiction affects the individual mentally, physically, spiritually, and emotionally, hitting the bottom has to shatter all four of those in order for those to come back together again to be what? Recovered. I'm not going to say renewed. I'll say in order to recover. Yeah, in order to recover. And I'm still looking in because I had some bomb stuff I wanted to put out here on Hitting Bottom. And I guess what I put out so far, it's not bombier enough. So anyway, oh yeah, guess what, y'all? I found it. So I just want to say this, right? So I wanted to like read it out of my notes. It says, the process of hitting bottom. Hitting bottom, for simplicity, when one hits a bottom, a rock bottom, the individual will experience a force or power so great it will be equal to or greater than that of the traumatic forces or powers of influence that resulted from the trauma that took place or that put the person into addiction, which I said, right? Or different phases and levels of addiction and the different, levels mentally, physically, spiritually, and emotionally. So, that being said, I found it. I done said it about 20 times, and I'm about to let this piece go. Like I said before, let's recover. Let's continue on the recovery path. Hit my subscribe button, and I'm going to tell you what my next piece is going to be. My next piece, since we talked about hitting bottom, we're going to talk about the next phase, admittance, the admission process. And what I want to talk about is denial, admittance, acceptance, surrender, and recovery. Denial, which we already talked about. Admittance, that's a part of the bottom we talked about. Acceptance, surrender, and recovery. So look for me, hit me up, and I'll see you in the next video. And y'all, let's recover, man. Let's get back our families, our neighborhoods, our communities. Let's get back to the challenges of life, because nothing's going to be easy. And understand, we are on the road to what? To enlightenment. And at what level you will be enlightenment to will be based on your spiritual awakenings, because recovery will promise you a spiritual awakening. And more spiritual awakenings you have, you will become enlightened. Now, am I enlightened? Yes. I'm claiming mine. Why? Because I've had a series of spiritual awakenings. And with that, I see y'all in the next video.